Top Med Talk.
Welcome to Top Med Talk. Today's piece is a discussion which originally followed 3 presentations at the Evidence Based Perioperaive Medicine World Congress in London. We were discussing artificial intelligence in perioperative medicine. As an informed listener, this likely will work as a standalone piece, but the presentations, which it is in part a response to, are available in the show notes. On the panel, you'll hear Feras Hatib, Vice President of R&D, Algorithms and Signal Processing, Organisation for Critical Care and Vascular at Edwards Lifesciences in Irvine, California. Adriane Chapman, Professor at the University of Southampton, Head of Digital Health Research Group, Director for the Centre of Health Technologies, and Sandy Jackson, Specialty Trainee in Anaesthetics and Intensive Care Medicine at the National Institute for Health and Care Research. This piece is chaired by Top Med Talk's co-editor-in-chief Mike Grocott, Professor of Anaesthesia and Critical Care Medicine at the University of Southampton. It's an enjoyable discussion, so enjoy.
What do we really need to worry about?
I think you need to worry about the cowboys. I titled the talk "Good, Bad, the Ugly" because what Feras actually presented is exactly the way it should be done. And one of the worries is that as the tools themselves become more and more powerful and more available to everybody, it's that much easier to pick it up and say, hey, got some data, let's go try it. And I absolutely do encourage every single one of you to go try it. You shouldn't be scared of the technology. The biggest thing to be scared of is the cowboys who are applying it without really understanding what it's doing or how to check it or how to consider how it works within the environment that it's sitting within.
Thank you. So, first, are healthcare organisations likely to adopt AI in any reasonable time frame? Many of us still use faxes. I don't know who put this question in. Maybe it was online. How do we get ahead of change? How do we get over the data barriers, the privacy barriers? There's lots of this work done around the country. Who wants to jump in?
I think there's a few different sort of things within there. So I think Feras has given you an answer of actually, can we adopt this in a reasonable time frame? For some of these things, yes, we can. I think what that question alludes to is sort of my grand vision for risk evaluation, which does require a much bigger piece of work around hospital data and IT infrastructure. Whereas I think where you see the easiest wins in AI is where it's already really coming to dominate. If you look at radiology and ophthalmology, this is a huge, huge deal because there they've got data sets of images that they have outcomes for and they can do advanced machine learning on those in a sophisticated way. Likewise, what Edwards have done is fantastic and is clearly a huge piece of work, but is an awful lot easier than trying to, as you say, get every single piece of the hospital system to talk nicely to each other, to then do everything Age has spoken about making sure that the provenance of that data is good and that it's tidy. So I think there are some easy wins to be had, and there are some much more difficult ones that will take time. But I actually think that it all runs alongside what we all kind of know we need to be doing with our hospital IT infrastructure anyway. If you take out the AI side of things, just in terms of making our working lives easier and making it easier for us to do our jobs and deliver our care to patients, we need better hospital IT. So it's part of an ongoing journey, I think.
Are you aware of examples of AI being used to prescribe perioperative exercise or any clinical evidence, and that the first 2 days of this conference were all about rehabilitation and exercise and that kind of thing? So no answer is okay, but if you've got an answer, that'd be great.
So all I can say is I know that people like, for example, Jerry Danger was talking about applying machine learning to CPET, and that's something he's endeavouring to do. And I think the interesting one then comes back to the interaction between that, again, is an easier win because CPET data, we've got it breath by breath in pretty good standard, to pretty good quality. We know that test is administered in a controlled way. We have lots of data. What gets interesting is if you then start taking, at the moment, what might we use? We might use something like DARSI to kind of estimate what we think the CPET's going to be. But if you then take DARSI combined with a wearable that either the patient already owns, or better still, to minimise digital exclusion, we give to them, you can then maybe start getting an idea of what they're already like and try and estimate what their physiology will be. But yeah, I'm not aware of anyone doing that at the moment.
Thank you. So the very optimistic person, and that's not a deliberate pun, but Optimize was a study we had presented this morning. And I think neither of the investigators involved have any intention currently of doing Optimize 3, but were we to do Optimize 3, this is a goal-directed hemodynamic study. Should we take the humans out of the loop altogether and use artificial intelligence to drive the hemodynamics? Sandy?
I suppose my answer would be, I think I agree with that question. I'm not sure I quite agree with exactly. I think you somewhat, whether you were controversially phrasing it, Mike, and say take the human out of the equation altogether. So I think the answer is it's around decision support. So I think it should be around using AI and machine learning to empower clinicians, not to replace them. I'm not saying that we'll never be replaced and the robots might be coming for us and Skynet is on its way, but I think we're a long way off that. I think what's far more useful is using it to optimize things. And I think the results that Edwards are already presenting are pretty compelling. And if that story keeps going down the observational line, then yes, potentially there is space for interventional studies, more interventional studies and bigger interventional studies demonstrating its role.
Adriane, so I know this isn't your area, but as I understand it, humans are unreliable. Just intrinsically, if we ask her to do the same thing again and again and again, we will not effectively do that. We're naturally unreliable. We're a system that fails, whereas the machines should be almost 100% reliable, and yet they have these biases. But aren't the biases largely a reflection of us, or are there additional biases that they're bringing to the table as well? Because if they're reliable and they're only as biased as us, then is there anything to worry about?
It's a really complex question. I'm going to actually start with a story if I have just a little bit of time. It's a beautiful story about automation bias. So Professor Howard at Georgia Tech sat down and brought in a bunch of people to a room to do a study. And they were met at the door with a little robot that says this way and comes to the waiting room. And while they're filling out their form for consent, the smoke alarm goes off. And they're met at the waiting room door with the exit door right here. And the little robot's there waving a little flag. And they follow the robot, statistically at a very high percentage, away from the exit door. She pushed it further. They will follow the robot away from the exit door into a dark room. They will follow the robot away from the exit door into a dark room that has furniture piled up in front of it where they have to duck down and crawl in. And they will do that even if there's smoke in the room. Right, so humans, we have this automation bias. The computer said so, it knows what's right. What Mike's asking, though, is a slightly more complex question because we are the creators of much of this data in the first place. And, I mean, as far as the Edwards example is perfect, that MAP is actually the data you have, but it's actually not the right data. And so there's this problem, this tension right now of, well, what data do we actually have? We were the creators of it. We already have our biases in this. And how do you decouple it? And we're nowhere near that answer right now, sadly. So I think we have to be there with common sense and a little better training about things like automation bias so that we don't walk into a dark and smoke-filled room when the exit door is right there.
So
I have a comment and a question for Rose. Firstly, thank you for your explanation of the physiology of hypotension or low perfusion as that metric that should define a hypotension. I think it was elegant how you presented the interaction and the dynamic interplay between all those forces that interrelate. And it may not necessarily be a pressure of 60 or whatever we artificially call it, though that's so easy to fall back on. The reason I say that, and I think it really underscores the importance of, if I may go back to the pokey recommendation number 1, falling into the trap of treating that number artificially without including or incorporating the other, if you will, dynamics of hemodynamics that are a part of the HDI monitor. So I think the data, even as presented here by you, speak strongly to that point, and it refutes, if you will, the arguments that we heard just a moment ago for not doing that. And I also appreciate your study, Monty, that was showing the relationship between microperfusion as assessed with, if you will, the microperfusion monitor and HDI. I only wish to make this point. It depends on the impetus for hypotension. If you reduce flow by a vasoconstrictive agent, either vasoconstrict or vasodilate, and you can increase the density or the volume of red cells that are going through that vessel. If you use ischemia as a metric to reduce flow, you recruit more capillaries. So you're not increasing the diameter or shrinking the diameter of a vessel, but you recruit more vessels. And that's the winking, blinking phenomenon that's been shown many, many years ago. So here again, I think it underscores the importance of using all of those parameters to understand what is the best way to treat that low perfusion phenomena as assessed in a surrogate way as low blood pressure. And I think it's really important to just make that point. Sorry for the long-winded explanation.
Yeah, of course, I completely agree, 100%. Yeah, so we are trying, with HPI, we're trying to provide as many parameters as possible for the clinicians to understand what is causing the hypotension, mostly focusing on either is it a preload issue, is it an afterload issue, is it a contractility issue. So we have secondary screens with all these parameters. So does the patient need fluid to correct the hypotension? Does the patient need vasopressors maybe inotropes, maybe something like ephedrine, right, that has both fluid with a vasopressor, all that stuff. So we provide that information. In our latest generation technology, we also automated that because clinicians said, it's too complicated for me, until I understand that information, hypotension already happens.
We as clinicians have an inclination to try to oversimplify. And so the idea that blood pressure would just be enough and good enough is so wrong, fundamentally.
Yeah.
It may be applicable most of the time, but it's fundamentally wrong physiologically.
Agree, 100%, yes. Thank you for the comments.
But presumably, if you think your physiological model is better worked through, you can work back. That's a question of application of the technology as opposed to actually it's a wrong approach, I think. If you work back from whatever your goal is, be it tissue perfusion, presumably if you apply AI to that goal and work back, you ought to be able to get an answer that allows us to do what we would have done, but more reliably.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think physiology is the only truth, even though AI may take advantage of a lot of data points that are likely going to lead to that same conclusion. It's not necessarily the truth. The only truth is physiology.
I'm going to change topic a bit. I think we may come back to that. Yes, sir.
Hi, James Prentice. I'm a consultant anaesthetist up in Newcastle. But I think with risk prediction models, they're all fixed. You've had a stroke, you've had an MI, you're ASA3. And when I sit in my pre-assessment clinic, most patients will still probably proceed with their operation, whatever that risk is. For me, a risk prediction model, we want the reversible risk factors, what happens when you stop smoking. But then does that play into what you were talking about with the police and go into the various different areas? And how are we going to combat that? Because it's really the reversibility and the prehabilitation that's going to be the important new aspect of a AI risk prediction model in a preoperative setting.
So one of my eye-opening conversations was sitting down with a clinician, and he sat down and he said, but my job is to stereotype. When I see a person of this ethnicity, of this age, with these general signs, I immediately go there instead of there. And these are the tests I'll order. By training, you are automatically told to stereotype and to do certain actions. And by doing those actions, you are creating the data, right, that we then would want to build with. This is the tension now between the approach that Edwards is taking with a more generic approach of saying, well, I'll take some data and apply some AI to it, right? From that, you are dependent now upon this data that is suddenly biased based on the treatment and how you would look at an individual and decide what path to take them. You would hope, it's a hope though, that a properly designed study would actually try to take some of those biases away and you will treat everybody the same in a trial that grabs data, but then you'll have to do a lot, right? Because now you need a lot of data that's not just taking some medical records that already exist, that we know have been created in this, biased is such a negative word, but created in this way that training has enforced, right? Whereas on the Edwards approach, it's very much taking and stripping it all the way back and saying, well, we know that this is what's in the data and the data is not right? We're going to look and see what we are actually seeing and what does that actually lead to, as opposed to starting with the raw data that we actually have to hand. I mean, I'm sure there was raw data to hand, but you augmented it in some way. And so, yes, your point here is actually exactly valid, right? By the nature of how patients are treated, we are developing this biased data. And we don't yet know how to get around that.
I mean, it's a great question. If we know the action that has been addressed, so the modifiable risk factor, and we're documenting that as well. Can that be incorporated into the models?
Yeah, so ultimately, right, you can incorporate in anything. So it could be the outcome, it can be the probability of that outcome. It depends which model you are going to choose. If that data is rich enough and you know that set of outcomes or the set of possible spread of outcomes and the risk for any particular group, then absolutely that can be done. I think some of the worry is that by nature of deciding on a course from the get-go, you take a patient down a particular path and you actually don't have that data for real.
Interesting.
I think from my perspective, just coming back on the clinical risk point, I agree with you on a lot of fronts. I think one thing that I would say, though, is there are two small suggestions that I would make. And one of those is that risk evaluation should continue throughout the perioperative course. And so actually, if you fix those modifiable risk factors, wouldn't it be great to have something that reflects that in your understanding clinical risk? So at the point of putting the patient off to sleep, it may be different than how you saw them when you first met them in pre-assessment clinic. And the other thing I would say is that you're absolutely correct. Almost all shared decision-making, even, particularly in things like cancer surgery, is probably going to go ahead, even if the outcome looks pretty bleak. But if you look at the data around things like surgical regret, the more patients have these discussions, particularly about the outcomes that matter to patients, and establishing what those are is something that only a clinician talking to that patient can do. That helps them to come to terms with what might be a bumpy ride afterwards, as we all know. And I think there is a lot to be said for shared decision-making, not to change what we do, but to help the patient come to terms with what they're about to face.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question from Slido. So the lack of socioeconomic status, functional capacity, for example, as potential biases in these standard outcome prediction techniques we've got, such as NSQIP, are they a source of bias? Can AI detect that? Can AI overcome it?
Permission to pass the buck, please.
So typically when we're looking for bias, right, we wouldn't necessarily use an AI tool to find the bias. We dig at it in other ways. So you look at how a tool responds, how you would expect it to respond in a neutral population. You look at the data itself to try to understand where the data is coming from, the provenance of it, what gaps, like what the profile of it is. Is it small in one area, large in another area? You apply multiple different types of AI to it and try to see if they match up or if the explanations come out in slightly different ways. You look at population shift within different data sets to understand whether you're seeing a change in the population, and would you expect that, or are you looking at a difference in reporting or a difference in just awareness, and so people are changing what's in the data, right? So you tend to not apply an AI tool to find the bias. You are often on a bit of a hunt and apply many other techniques to find it either before or after you've used it in an AI tool.
So if your training data covers quite well the population that you want to use the model on, it's not going to be biased or anything. The model will work quite fine. The issue is that you may have outliers, right, that the model never seen before. That's why during training it's not about the number of patients or number of data points that you use. It's about, are you covering your patient population? Could be one patient, but if it is the right patient, that will change your model dramatically.
So I'm going to jump ahead to a question that very clearly links to this. So is the HPI algorithm valid for all ethnic groups? And if not, is the way for you to notify the algorithm or the algorithm to notify you that in this context, validity is questionable?
We have not seen really differences in different ethnic groups. The FDA asked us sort of need to have a representative groups of the US population with all kinds of ethnicities and races, genders, patient populations and stuff like that. So we haven't seen any bias to any group. It's because HPI uses basic physiology, right, to do the prediction. And that physiology is the same, right? It works also on an animal model.
Well, I guess one could argue, I don't know, Sol might argue, that actually physiology may not be exactly the same in...
Yeah, I would argue it is.
Interesting. I would suspect that it might be a little bit different. If some populations on average are a bit taller, a bit shorter, et cetera, then their physiological responses may be varied.
That which constitutes inadequate perfusion is universal. That's a physiologic phenomenon. what that pressure is under the circumstances might vary, but that's not the definition of low perfusion. We've presumed that to be a surrogate based on observational trials that are associated with adverse outcome. And so that's been our convenient clinical marker, but that's not the physiologic discussion of hypoperfusion scenario. And so that which constitutes low perfusion is a physiologic universal reality. Don't you agree?
Yeah. No, based on the things like incidence of frostbite in different populations, which is highly variable, but that's probably a conversation for another day. Slightly. So for us, another specific, probably reasonably quick fire question. The EV100 is being discontinued at the end of this year. The Hemisphere will be the replacement. Will HPI come as standard on the new ones?
Of course, yes.
Yes.
And many more stuff in addition to HPI.
Of course, yes, and much more. Excellent. That was easy. Another quick fire. Sandy, can DGHs get involved in the Periop AI revolution too, or are we biased against them?
So I think a lot of it is going to depend around your procurement cycles to a certain extent. If you look out in the hall outside, almost all the industry partners are working towards these kind of goals, towards making data more accessible to make it more usable for clinicians. So I don't think it's just big hospitals that get involved. I think small hospitals can, but I think what is beholden to those of us who are developing these things is to make sure that they are not just for us, that they are interoperable and can work in other systems. You shouldn't be developing something only for you. You should be developing it with at least half an eye to, and how can I share this with the world and with other centres? So it may be that you end up with collaborations doing this, but I think working together we can achieve more.
And Cypher, which is our main AI-focused collaboration at the moment, is currently DGH working with the teaching hospital. So Simon Davis in York is a valued partner. John.
Okay, Sandy, I have a question for you because, first of all, great analogy, The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, one of my favorite movies. So I'm going to ask you an ugly question about AI. Feras, this is the second time I've seen you talk, and each time you talk, I learn more about, to Dr. Aronson's thing, the physiology of flow or flow of physiology, whatever you want to say. But when the bad of this, the Cleveland Clinic did a really elegant study a number of years ago looking at viscosity of blood flow and how it affected the ends of rotational tissues. So flow isn't the only perspective and being able to perfuse tissues. How do you throw in the concept of viscosity of blood as well too, and add that to your AI? Because that's an important component as well of perfusing organs is viscosity of the blood. Yet that's not included in the AI. So is that a bad that you could add, or is that a whole different perception that you have to look at?
So I think the reality is we have got some surrogate markers that we can use to try and estimate viscosity. And and it's all about the systems talking to each other. And actually, if the systems talk to each other, then there is no reason why you can't start integrating that. In much the same way as actually when you see on the monitor what's going on, and then you get a blood gas that gives you some information, you as a clinician already do that and make that judgment of what you think is going on and may try and adjust things like viscosity. A computer is capable of doing that, but it's all about tying the various systems together to integrate them, really. But there is absolutely no reason why you can't train a system to do that.
But also is the same problem. It's not available in data, right? And then also the definition of viscosity, how you define it, and what do you use as a reference and all that stuff.
Hemoglobin and temperature.
But if you have it, of course, you could use it, yeah.
And I think it actually comes back, like this is a perfect question that highlights the major point of this discussion that's been going round and round today, is if you had the data, if you are measuring, unfortunately, I can't even answer this, but is whatever is in your data, what is you're actually measuring, is it a proxy for something that you as a clinician then translate into some other speak and I have to do this and this and this, or is it actually the thing that needs to change and be measured? Because if you're measuring a proxy, yes, the AI can do something, but you might just be working on a proxy and it's not the under root cause.
This is just the beginning.
Yeah.
As you get more data, and again, it's a collection of data to determine what you can measure, what you cannot measure, then how to put it together. So it'll be an interesting future that'll probably use on me when I'm 70 years old in a couple of years. So,
and I think it's something we've already been discussing, which is that ultimately we as clinicians are making those judgments ourselves, and to assume that we are definitely better than the machine may not be perfect. I know I certainly am not perfect. So And again, this is why I say you don't let it make the decision, you make the decision in concert. So you work out, going back to the TCI pump example, I know plenty of consultants who will meticulously check exactly how much of a bolus it's going to give when you start that TCI dose, just as a common sense check, because that's beholden on you as a clinician. Don't just trust the machine, question it, understand how it works, and work in partnership with it.
So the question at the very bottom, given that AI is many times a black box, what is the role of visualization models as if you like, a decision support to understand the drivers of individual predictions?
So there's lots of kind of visualizations and explainable AI is the thing, right? So there's Lime, there's Shaft, there's a bunch of these kind of tools. And they are a tool, and I actually think they do fairly well at trying to say, in general, this is why the black box did this thing. There's some caveats to this, that sometimes the way these actually work is not by saying, given this model, this is how it's worked. They let the model go do its thing, and then they create another model about the explanation. So you have to make sure that the two models are similar enough that you're actually getting an explanation for what you need. I would actually also argue that they don't show the whole picture, right? So everybody is so focused on AI, right? That these explanations are really only looking at that little black box. When hopefully one of the takeaways you've gotten from today is it's not just this little black box, right? It's everything from the choice of the data that you're in and you've chosen to do, and does it cover, does it have the right sample and population, all the way through what actually algorithms did you use, to all the way through, and how would this be interpreted in this context, right? So there's a larger set of explanations that are needed in this case, not just, they're great tools and please do use them, especially when you go off and use and build your own AI systems, right? Experiment, please. But I think actually there's a lot of work there to do as well.
And I think there's also a discussion to be had amongst us as clinicians, because there are differing degrees of black box. There can be a very, very black box, and there can be a somewhat translucent black box that maybe you can see into. And that's something that we as clinicians need to have discussions amongst ourselves and with patients and say, how important is it that we can see inside that black box? Or are we happy to hand more control over? And that may vary depending on what we're looking at.
But unfortunately, it's going to be a black box. You don't have a choice, right? So our model that I just showed, it's a logistic regression, and I consider that the simplest possible model in machine learning, straightforward, very deterministic. But that model that we used, it's like one cell in a big organism, like, let's say, what ChatGPT uses. Like, they use millions of logistic regressions within their think in a very complex way. So that is it's going to be a black box. And I tell you the truth, even some machine learning, like core machine learning people, they don't even understand how that black box learns, but it learns, right? Because, so it's going to be a black box. So what we are trying to do to help clinicians, we try to provide all that extra information that could explain what the model is doing based on physiology. But unfortunately, it's going to be a black box.
Right, it is 3:29. I wasn't deliberately avoiding that question. I thought it was a good closing question. I know that only one of you is a perioperative clinician, but all of us are potentially patients. So your views of value, what are the quickest wins for using AI in perioperative care, so the care of patients undergoing surgery or before and after surgery? What patient groups, what care pathways, what questions? What would you like solved? Age.
Oh, that's I think too hard. I because honestly, I don't actually know what the low-hanging fruit in this particular domain is. I can see where I would want to get to in many, many years, but that's not the low-hanging fruit. I'm so sorry.
So I think for patient groups and care pathways, it's the same as it almost always is for our novel perioperative interventions, which is it's going to be the higher risk patients because that's where there's the most to gain. It's probably not going to be the very highest risk because actually they're already going to be having pretty much the kitchen sink thrown at them. It's for making that decision around the intermediate to high risk. I think that's where potentially you have the most scope to change things. And honestly, I think in some ways the quickest wins are in tools that are already out there that are potentially changing the way we do things.
For us,
I think the most important element in building like future machine learning and artificial intelligence type of techniques is for them to be based on physiology, because that's extremely important. Otherwise, if you just put data, they could learn statistically something that is not what you want. Right? So the physiology is the core.
And if it's a black box, how do you know that it's based on physiology?
Well, it learns the complexity of the physiology.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. Really, really great discussion. Thank you to the panel. Thanks to all of you.
Top Med Talk. Thanks for downloading Top Med Talk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, Top Med Talk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence Based Perioperaive Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now.